Emily Carter found a whole dumpling tucked into Ruth Bennett's sheets, and in that single instant, understood that something had shifted irreparably. It wasn't the dumpling itself so much as what it represented. An overlooked rule, a missed instruction, a small break in the chain that kept a fragile life steady. Ruth Bennett had been bedbound for years. Dementia had become part of her rhythm, shrinking the world to a few familiar textures. The worn quilt on her bed, the chipped teacup on the nightstand, the routine of meals that had to be prepared to a precise consistency. Ruth responded to few things now, but she responded to care. Emily Carter, her granddaughter, treated those routines like instructions for survival, not merely chores. Emily's mother, Denise Carter, had helped shoulder most of the responsibility, and for as long as Emily could remember, they'd managed on the assumption that careful attention would be enough. 95% of viewers aren't subscribed. Subscribing is free, takes seconds, and makes a real impact. Click subscribe and be part of the growth. Please turn on the bell for more updates. When Chloe Martinez came recommended by a neighbor, both Emily and Denise wanted to trust the suggestion. Chloe was 21, polite, and soft-spoken, and she seemed eager to fit into the household's steady patterns. Emily had written a clear, single-page care guide for her. Blend every meal to the specified texture, log water intake, report any changes, and give at least a day's notice if a shift couldn't be covered. The page used simple language because clarity mattered more than professionalism. There was no room for ambiguity. At the start, Chloe listened and thanked them. She tucked the paper into her bag and nodded as Emily demonstrated the blender settings. Emily remembered showing her how the food should look after processing, how a single misstep could make a solid bite dangerous for Ruth. Chloe watched with polite attention, and Emily left with the sense that she had done what she could to prevent mistakes. Small things began to accumulate. Chloe would chop instead of blend, believing smaller pieces were sufficient. She would answer questions with a minimal sentence and then wait, as though she expected a follow-up prompt before offering details. Emily found herself asking the same questions. How much water? Did she finish breakfast? How long had Ruth been awake? And receiving answers that felt rounded rather than precise. Once, Chloe canceled a shift with only 30 minutes' notice. Another time she said she had not seen a message on a phone that sat on the kitchen counter, with its screen lit by an incoming notification. Emily did not want to overreact to teen errors, but each omission added up. Emily tried to teach rather than scold. She rewrote the instruction guide into a laminated checklist and taped it to the blender. She walked Chloe through the process again, longer this time, showing the blending texture and marking the timer. Chloe nodded and practiced, hands a touch uncertain. Emily left the kitchen twice convinced the problem had been solved. The next day, the blender stood untouched. The dumpling found its way into Ruth's bed a few months after Chloe started. Emily discovered it by chance, smoothing the blanket and feeling a lump against the quilt. She picked it up, examined it, as if holding that compact piece of food might explain everything. It could have been an accident. It could have been dropped during a transfer, a fragment from a forgotten pocket. But it bore no signs of having been blended or processed. It was whole. For someone with dysphagia, whole bites could be catastrophic. That reality reframed every earlier annoyance as potential danger. Emily set the dumpling on the kitchen table and waited for Denise. When her mother descended the stairs and read the scene, the house held its breath not because of drama, but because of calculation. Denise's mistrust of strangers had always been an obstacle. She preferred the imperfect comfort of familiarity to the chaos of starting over. Yet facing the dumpling meant confronting an uncomfortable balance. Keep a person who made mistakes and hope for improvement, or accept the upheaval of seeking new help. They spoke without puncturing the surface of the problem with anger. Emily described the pattern: chopping instead of blending, the muted responses, the canceled shifts, the unreturned messages, and did so in a tone that recorded facts rather than moral judgments. Denise listened and allowed herself to acknowledge the stakes. They both knew that Ruth's life could hinge on a single overlooked detail. After that, Emily watched more closely. She watched Chloe move through the house like someone who was trying to be careful, but lacked urgency. Chloe arranged medications in order, folded blankets with attention, and adjusted pillows with a gentleness that suggested caring intentions. But where intent existed, comprehension did not always follow. Tasks that required a technical understanding, timing a blend for exactly 30 seconds, testing the texture until only one smoothness remained, were the ones Chloe seemed to miss. When Emily left lists and demonstrations, Chloe watched and repeated the steps. Then, when Emily checked later, there would be inconsistencies, uneven blends, trays returned with untouched sips of water, log entries that read like guesses. One afternoon, Emily found a bowl in the sink with food that had been chopped rather than blended. Shelf-stable labels lay open beside it. A spatula had been left in the bowl. Chloe hovered by the counter, eyes on her phone, and when Emily quietly asked about the bowl, Chloe offered a small apology and said she thought the pieces looked soft enough. The word "thought" sat in Emily's head like a thin thread that threatened to snap. The missed messages continued. Emily sent a straightforward note. Had Ruth taken her meds? Did she drink enough water? A reply came hours later that said Chloe hadn't seen the message. The phone on the counter had a bright screen showing multiple alerts. Whether the delayed response was negligence, forgetfulness, or something else, Emily could not risk guessing. The pattern demanded action. Denise worried aloud about the upheaval of replacing someone. Interviews, background checks, telling a person they no longer fit. Those things felt like an emotional investiture Denise wasn't eager to make again. She loved her mother and feared making a mistake that would leave them exposed while they searched for a better option. Emily understood the reluctance, but her convictions about safety pushed at the edges of that fear. It wasn't just procedural failures. There was a human dimension that made decisions harder. Chloe smiled in ways that suggested she wanted to learn. She brought small, thoughtful items, an extra blanket one evening, a cup of tea another, and she never left with a visible attitude. She seemed sincere. The truth was that unreliability and care can coexist, and that contradiction made Emily's choices messier. She wanted to believe in Chloe's capacity to improve, but Ruth's safety did not allow indefinite time for improvement. A week after the dumpling, Emily walked into the kitchen to find Chloe making breakfast. The blender lid sat beside the appliance, untouched. Food on the chopping board looked manageable to an untrained eye, but dangerous to anyone who knew Ruth's limitations. Chloe started spooning the mixture into a bowl, not noticing the inconsistent texture. Emily did not announce herself. She reached for the bowl, turned it into the processor, and blended the meal until its texture matched the laminated checklist on the blender. Chloe turned when Emily finished, a look of startled confusion on her face. She thanked Emily in a low voice and resumed her duties, but the exchange was small consolation for a problem with broader consequences. Emily recognized that her intervention might spare Ruth immediate risk, but it did not erase the pattern. It only highlighted the point that the household could not be a training ground for someone whose learning curve threatened another person's well-being. Emily spoke with Denise again, this time in language free from supposition. She listed concrete incidents, dates, and the specific consequences they could cause. They both traced the timeline like professionals building a case: the initial instruction sheet, the repeated mistakes, the canceled shifts, the dumpling. Denise gathered the strength to acknowledge that comfort could not outrank safety. She agreed with Emily that change had to happen. They did not want to cause Chloe harm, only to protect Ruth. But the act of protection required clarity. Emily drafted a note, calm, simple, and firm, stating that they would be moving in a different direction with care. She asked Denise to read it, and Denise sat for a long moment before signing her approval. They decided together that they would offer Chloe a final conversation in person before ending the arrangement. an exchange founded in courtesy even amid necessity. When they told Chloe, she met the news with an expression that contained confusion and something close to resignation. She said she was sorry, that she had wanted to do better, and that she had not realized the impact of her mistakes. Her voice held a softness that made the moment uneasy. She packed a small bag that afternoon and left without drama. The house felt altered by her absence more, because her presence had been woven into daily life than because it had been welcomed without reservation. In the days that followed, Emily carried unsolved tension like a small, steady weight. They began interviewing replacements, reviewing resumes, asking specific, practical questions about experience with dysphagia, with timed blending, with home routines. The process felt transactional and intimate at once. Transactional in the way they asked precise questions about procedure, and intimate in the way they invited strangers into the private space where Ruth lived. Ruth, for her part, continued to exist within the boundaries of her own perception. She accepted food, slept in measured stretches, and responded to gestures more than words. Her life did not change shape because of staffing shifts. That constancy made Emily's decisions both clearer and lonelier. It meant that any misstep could be the thing that altered Ruth's small world forever. As they scheduled interviews, Emily took time to reorganize the lists taped to the blender, to clean the kitchen counters, to write down the 3 things that any candidate absolutely needed to do on their first day. She left the laminated checklist where it would be visible to anyone who walked into the kitchen. The process made her feel less at sea. One afternoon, after a long screening call with a potential caregiver, Emily sat on the couch and allowed herself to consider the complexity of what they had done. Hiring and firing were not simply administrative tasks, they were choices that affected dignity and safety in equal measure. She thought about Chloe, her missteps, and her good intentions, and felt a complicated knot of sympathy and resolve. The household moved forward with a different rhythm. Task lists were clearer, shift overlaps were rearranged to guarantee a smoother handoff, and every candidate they interviewed was tested against the simple measure that had failed before. Would they blend the food to the exact texture required without prompting? When the new caregiver arrived, she brought steady hands and a look that matched the practical intensity Emily had been trying to protect for months. She read the laminated checklist like an instruction manual, timed a blend to the second, and logged water intake with the precision of someone who had been taught and had also learned to value structure. Ruth accepted her with the small indifference of someone whose world had condensed to immediate comforts. Denise exhaled in a way Emily recognized as relief. Yet relief came with a residue of something else, an awareness that choices had been made, small and large, that rearranged their lives. Emily found herself returning to the napkin where the dumpling had once rested, tracing its absence like a small proof that they had acted. She did not imagine the path forward would be trouble-free, only that they had removed one risk from the long list they managed daily. On a cool evening, Emily went to Ruth's room and smoothed the blanket until its fold lay straight and calm. She checked the side table, adjusted a pillow, and folded the laminated checklist in half to slip into her pocket. She did not say a prayer or make a speech. She simply sat for a moment and watched the slow measures that kept Ruth steady, the small rituals that preserved trust in people who cared. The decisions had been difficult, the process exacting and personal. But when Emily rose and moved toward the hallway, she carried with her a precise knowledge that some choices are made not to punish, but to secure, and that once those choices are enacted, life reroutes itself around them. The house was different now, calibrated to a standard they would not compromise. She closed the door behind her and felt the hours ahead settle into a new arrangement, one shaped by the dumpling and the decisions it forced, and by the awareness that every ordinary task could be the one that mattered most. Thanks for watching Story Frame. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell for more updates. See you in the next video.